Texas, tempting and beautiful. Texas was beautiful. Texas was tempting. All that land that seemed made just to grow cotton. That Texas land was part of Mexico and controlled by Spain. It had been so since the 16th century when Spanish explorers De Soto, Cabeza de Vaca, Fray Marcos, Esteban, and Coronado searched for gold and 7 fabled cities of Cibola. Those 7 cities turned out to be imaginary, but the invaders carried some things with them that were real, although no one then could even imagine them. They were germs. Germs that killed most of the Native American population. So, in the early 19th century, the vast land of Texas was almost empty of people. Perhaps 30,000 Indians lived there, and a few thousand Spanish Mexicans. 30,000 may sound like a lot of people, but not in Texas. A 20th century sports stadium, the Houston Astrodome, holds 54,816 people. The Spaniards had built missions in Texas where priests lived, farmed, and attempted to convert Indians to Christianity. Soldiers lived in presidios, which is the Spanish word for forts. The presidios protected the missions. Some Mexicans were ranchers and lived on haciendas, which were ranch plantations where cattle and crops were raised. The Spanish-speaking cowboys were called vaqueros. Spain had hoped that some of its citizens would settle in Texas, as European settlers settled in the United States, but not many did. There was no gold in Texas and no political or religious freedom. In the Spanish colonies, everyone was expected to be Catholic. That didn't bother Stephen Austin. In 1821, he led some settlers to Texas from Missouri. The settlers said that they would become good Mexican citizens and Catholics. That same year, Mexico rebelled against Spanish rule and became independent. 3 years later, in 1824, the Mexicans approved a fine constitution and formed a republic. Unfortunately, there was no tradition of self-government in the Spanish colonies, as there had been in English colonies. The people weren't used to running things themselves. That made it easy for strong, ambitious people to take power. And soon, a dictator named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna took over. Santa Anna ignored many of the freedoms the Constitution had promised. Other people from the United States began settling in Texas. Some of them didn't want to be Mexican citizens. Some of them didn't want to become Catholics. They wanted schools and freedom of religion. They wanted to build towns and run those towns themselves. Some brought slaves, which was against Mexican law. Some didn't want to share the land with Indians. Some even bragged about killing Indians. By 1830, there were more English-speaking Americans in Texas than Mexicans. Santa Anna said no more Americans would be allowed to settle in Texas. That didn't stop them. People from the states crossed the border illegally and settled in Mexican territory. They demanded the rights of the Mexican Constitution of 1824. The issues and conflicts were complicated. You can see that there would be trouble. Then, in December of 1835, some Texas rebels attacked San Antonio. We went through the old adobe and picket houses of the Mexicans using battering rams made of logs 10 or 12 feet long. How the women and children would yell when we knocked holes in the walls through which we passed, wrote one rebel. Other Texans occupied the garrisons of San Patricio and Goliad. The Mexicans were not about to sit back and do nothing. In 1836, Santa Anna marched through Texas with a big army. He was determined to rout the Anglos, the English-speaking Americans, some of whom ran back to the United States. But those who stayed gathered in the old chapel-walled San Antonio mission called the Alamo. They intended to fight. There weren't even 200 of them, but they included Davy Crockett, William Travis, and Jim Bowie. Crockett had a rifle he called Old Betsy. He said Old Betsy had killed 105 bears one season, and maybe that was true. Crockett was a great storyteller. He said it was his storytelling ability, not his speech-making skills, that got him elected when he decided to go into politics. The thought of having to make a speech made my knees feel mighty weak and set my heart to fluttering, almost as bad as my first love scrape. But as good luck would have it, those big candidates spoke nearly all day, and when they quit, The people were worn with fatigue, which afforded me a good apology for not discussing the government. But I listened mighty close to them and was learning pretty fast about political matters. When they were all done, I got up and told some laughable story and quit. I found I was safe in those parts, and so I went home, and I didn't go back until after the election was over. But to cut this matter short, I was elected, doubling my competitor, and 9 votes over. Giving a campaign speech may have scared Davy Crockett, but once he got to U.S. Congress, he was fearless. He stood up and spoke out, even when he disagreed with the president, popular Andrew Jackson. When President Jackson sent the Cherokee Indians from their homes to Georgia and the Oklahoma Territory, Davy Crockett thought it was wrong, and he said so. It didn't help the Native Americans or Crockett. He lost the seat in Congress, but he kept saying, "My conscience and my judgment." Jim Bowie was a fearsome fighter who designed a wicked razor-sharp knife that is still called by his name. Travis, Crockett, and Bowie, and the others in the Alamo held out for 12 days. Supplies and ammunition ran low. "I shall never surrender or retreat, victory or death," Travis declared. He was not to be victorious. 1 soldier, a few women and children, and a slave survived to tell the story. At Goliad, 330 Americans did surrender, and they were all murdered. The remaining English-speaking settlers in Texas were furious. On March 2nd, 1836, 4 days before the Alamo fell, they decided to fight for independence. They were soon yelling, "Remember the Alamo!" Their leader was Sam Houston. He had been born in Virginia, but when he was 13 years old, his parents moved to the frontier of Tennessee. At age 15, he was working in a store in Tennessee when he ran away from home. He became a Cherokee Indian, adopted into a tribe, and lived with the Indians for 3 years. Then he came back to the white settlements. There are some of the things he did. He taught school. He fought in Andrew Jackson's army. He studied law. He was elected to Congress, and he became governor of Tennessee. But when his young wife left him, he was in despair. He became an Indian again, this time for 4 years, and moved to Texas as an Indian trader. Sam Houston and his followers decided to fight Santa Anna at San Jacinto, which is near the city that is now called Houston. It was April of 1836. The Texans were outnumbered, but they were smart. They waited for the siesta hour, which is the time after lunch when some Spaniards and Mexicans take a nap. It didn't take long, some say only 15 minutes, and Houston and his men captured Santa Anna and routed the Mexicans. They made Santa Anna sign a treaty that made Texas an independent nation. Sam Houston was elected president of the new nation, the Republic of Texas. Texas had its own flag with 1 lone star on it. Houston wanted Texas to become part of the United States. There should have been no problem with that, except that some Texans wanted to have slaves. By this time, the United States was divided. There were slave states and free states, and they were equal in number. If Texas became a state and a slave state, the South would have more votes in Congress than the North. That would create trouble. President Andrew Jackson had to say no to his old soldier friend Sam Houston. Texas stayed independent. Finally, in December 1845, while James K. Polk was president, Congress made Texas a state, the 28th state. Sam Houston was now a Texas senator. By this time, slavery was becoming a hot issue. The abolitionists were trying to end slavery. The slave owners were trying to convince everyone that slavery was a good thing. They wanted the United States to become a slave nation. When they realized that wasn't going to happen, many Texans and other Southerners began saying that the South should go its own way, and that the Southern states should secede from the United States and become a separate nation, a nation built upon slavery. Sam Houston disagreed. He worked hard to make Texas a part of the Union. He hated the idea of secession, and he didn't like slavery. It took courage to say what he thought, especially in 1859, which was when he was elected governor again. But when he refused to take an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy, he was forced to resign. That was 1861. Now it is 1846, and trouble is brewing on that Mexican border.